All right, session number 3 here, second one of the morning. We are going to address this topic. Does God have an ideal form of civil government? And let me begin with this. We live in a day when man is aggressively trying to redefine the definition of a family. We see that sex outside of marriage is celebrated now. Divorce has been accepted as the norm, and man is even pushing and continuing to push to legalize same-sex marriage. I want you to know that God has tolerated a lot, but God's standards have not changed. And what is God's ideal for a marriage? Well, when asked about his intent, Jesus said in Matthew 19, "Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave a father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one. Wherefore they are no more two, but one. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." So God has answered the question. God's patience has put up with a lot. But don't confuse what God is tolerating with what his ideal or what his intent is. Well, how do we know what God's ideal is? Well, we look at the law of first mention. When God got started, what did he do to begin with? He created Adam and he created Eve, and that was the definition of a family. Now, we know that God established the realm that we call civil government, but there's one type that's more in line with what God's design or intent is than the other. And we ask the question, well, what was God's original form of government? And we naturally think of a monarchy when we think of Israel. That is our original conception, but that's wrong. We think of kings and monarchies. Well, it's true that God was to be their king, but Israel in its original form was not a monarchy. The nation of Israel was a commonwealth of 12 sovereign tribes, or what we might call states, with legal boundaries, with a common worldview, operating under a unifying constitution, the Torah, the law. Now, we often think of the law of God only in a spiritual perspective. However, the law consisted of 3 sections. First of all, there's that area that we just technically call the law. That is an illustration of God's morality. That transcends time. Things like do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Those principles never change. Then there's a section that dealt with God's ceremonial sacrifice system. That was labeled the statutory law. That was the system that pointed to the Lamb of God, which was coming, which was sufficient to take away the sin of the world. When that was fulfilled by the Lamb of God being sacrificed, the veil in the temple between the Holy of Holies and the holy place was rent in twain from top to bottom. We no longer needed a high priest after the order of Aaron. We now had a king and priest after the order of Melchizedek. And we didn't just have access one day a year at the Day of Atonement. We could, as Paul said, with boldness and confidence approach the throne of mercy and grace at any time and all times. Then there's a section called the judgments. That is dealing with the civil law. In this area, you had such spiritual things as when you stop for camp, make sure and build your latrines outside the camp. Well, that doesn't sound very spiritual to me, does it? But it sounds very practical for a loving, merciful God that's looking out for the well-being and health and safety of his people. The idea of building a banister on the roof of your house. How many of you all have banisters on the roof of your house? None of you? And you call yourself Christians. Well, no, now we have shingles or tile. We have 6 and 12 and 8 and 12 pitch roofs. Of course, in the Jewish home, upstairs was a patio. And God, because of his care for his people, said, make sure and you build a railing or a banister on the patio so you don't topple over the edge, because I don't want you to fall off and kill yourself, break your neck. Some of the laws that are very practical. In a day when they didn't have refrigeration, you can eat the sacrifice on the first day. You can even eat leftovers on the second day. However, on the third day, don't eat it. Throw it away. Well, is that really all that spiritual? No, but it is very practical when you don't have a 24-foot refrigerator that you can put your leftovers in. The idea of taking pottery, and if you had blood in it, breaking it because you couldn't clean it. The blood would seep into the pottery itself, so that was to be broken and not reused. But if it was a brass instrument, then you could scour it out with water and reuse it. Was that really practical? Yes. Spiritual? Really not so much. It was really God looking out for the welfare of his people. So you've got 3 areas of the law. God's morality, which transcends time. You've got statutory, which was fulfilled by the sacrifice of Jesus. Then you've got the judgments, which was practical civil law for the well-being of his people. Many American codes come from civil law. It's a good idea, but we're not bound to it religiously. But understand, within the overall law of God, within the comprehensive nature of this law, there were policies that dealt with basic banking and business, fair weights and measures, fair trade, debt, bankruptcy. A person was limited to the amount of debt that he could assume. You had the ability to mortgage up to 6 years of the value of your labor, but not beyond that. You can even mortgage your property up to 50 years, but you couldn't sell it. Then it would be returned to your family on the year of return. They were taught as a people to be productive, to be prepared to lend, but they were advised not to be overladen in debt. Don't become borrowers. If you were caught cheating in business, you didn't go to jail. You paid it back. You worked it off with a penalty. If you stole something, you didn't go to jail. You paid it back fourfold with a penalty. You worked off the value of what you had taken. There were rules for sanitary safety, whether that be the latrine outside the camp or the proper washing of dishes or the whole idea of washing your hands before you ate was God's instruction to his people. The idea of putting sick people into quarantine is a biblical principle. Quarantining well people in their house is a violation of our liberty. Why would God deal with such trivial matters? Well, God is concerned with the health and well-being of his people. Rules so that they would not be overworked, requiring them to take 1 day off out of every 7. Both the employee and the employer and even their animals were rested on the 7th day. Rules that pertained to taking care of the poor, not handouts, but charity, where the poor could work for their food by gleaning the fields and feel the sacrifice of providing for their own families. There were rules that pertained to morality in the family, rules that pertained to military service. Legally, no man could be found guilty without a fair trial, and guilt could only be established at the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses. God had established in Israel the outline that I gave to you last night. The areas of self-government, family government responsibility, civil authority, and then in their dispensation, of course, they had the priesthood. Now we are the priesthood of believers. But understand that Israel was not ruled by a king or a giant central government. During major times of crises, the 12 tribes would come together, and God would raise up a ruler whom would follow the people with their consent. Moses was an example of that time of a ruler that led the people out of captivity. Joshua was an example of that kind of a military general who led in the conquest of the promised land and to divide up the land. God would raise up judges during time of oppression, somewhat like the 13 colonies calling on young George Washington to lead the Continental Army. They were a commonwealth of 12 tribes, or I would call them states, governed by one rule of law. There was no need for major taxes, as there was no standing central government and no standing army. There was a militia of every able-bodied man across the 12 tribes. And they trusted in God by obeying what God had told them to do and by doing it God's way, following God's design, rather than putting their confidence in man and a powerful, centralized government. They were commanded to choose out from among themselves capable men that feared God, loved truth, and hated covetousness. And those men were to judge righteously in all matters according to the law, and not show favoritism to the rich or to the poor. There was a national assembly of elders that represented the tribes themselves in national assemblies. And then there were elders at the local level that judged in the gates of the city. There were rulers or judges over tens, over 50s, over hundreds, and over thousands. Bribery was strictly forbidden. As I said a moment ago, there was to be no favoritism to the poor or to the rich. The law very clearly says that you could enslave yourself for up to 6 years if you had debt. You enslave yourself up to 30 years now on a home mortgage. But it was a capital offense to steal a man and make a slave out of him. If you were guilty of that, you were in fact put to death. The goal was righteousness for the people. The goal was a righteous, just government for God's people. Unfortunately, in 1 Samuel, as Samuel was near death, the Philistines were an imminent threat to their security. And rather than trusting God and obeying his instruction and following the law, there was no security, there was no safety, there was no order, because the scripture says that every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. We would call that anarchy. Now understand, originally they had no king. God gave them a constitution, the rule of law, and they were to be self-governing. But only a moral people are capable of self-government. If you have strong self-government, strong families, and strong churches, you don't need a lot of prisons and you don't need a lot of police officers, because we're going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. This is a biblical truth. It's not lost on our founding fathers. Ben Franklin said only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of rulers. John Adams, as president, issued this dire warning. Our Constitution was constructed for small central government. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and Christian people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. But as man continued to disobey, not trust God, in his disobedience, moving towards anarchy, man cried out, we need a strong central government that can take care of us when we have needs and protect us from our enemies and tell us what to do. You read in 1 Samuel, God warned them, you're not going to like this. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. Samuel was disappointed because they thought that he had failed. God said, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They are rejecting me. Now, with this biblical background, let's jump forward about 3,000 years. In 1887, we had a man that would become President of the United States named Woodrow Wilson. He's one of the worst presidents in our nation's history. He was very much a progressive. In 1887, when he was still a university president, he wrote an article that was published in the oh good grief, what was the document? It was published in the Political Science Quarterly in July of 1887. He wrote an article, and let me just paraphrase. He said this: what one generation will resist but eventually accept, the next generation will accept it because their parents had, and every generation thereafter will assume that it's always been that way. That's where we are today. Brief review. Some of this we covered in the first section. Remember, the Puritans and the Pilgrims were free men. They were under authority of the King of England, but by their charters, they were free men. They could elect their own legislators. They could make their own laws. They could tax themselves as they deemed necessary. They could own property, buy, sell, and trade with whomever they chose. Most importantly, they were free to study the Bible and to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth without having to serve at the whim of the Church of England. As I shared in the last session, over time, the king became tyrannical. He began violating the law. He was bound by the Constitution, bound by the charters. And as we showed you in the first session, even God told Israel that when the king assumed the throne, he was limited to the law. He was not to deviate to the right or to the left. He was instructed to follow the law exactly. Well, this man was defying the law and doing what he wanted to do. He was, in fact, the rebel, not the American colonists. And of course, ultimately, they were going to attack religious liberty as well. And as you saw last night, we reviewed today, it was the pastors of the day that were the sons of Issachar. They would ascend into their elevated pulpits every Sunday morning in their black clerical robes and stir the people's hearts toward liberty. They were public enemy number one, derogatorily referred to as the Black-Robed Regiment. As a matter of fact, one of the ideas for the United States seal was offered by Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams on July 4th, 1776. And in this seal, which ultimately we chose the one with the eagle and the shield, you all know what I'm talking about, but this was one of the ideas. We've got Pharaoh and the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea. You've got Moses and the Israelites standing on the seashore. In the background center, you've got the Shekinah, the glory of God, the pillar of a fire and the pillar of a cloud. And around the outside says rebellion to tyranny is obedience to God. You're going to hear from Pastor Dan later on when he talks about Romans 13 in detail. But let me very quickly ask you, when the Hebrew midwives were commanded to murder the male Hebrew babies, what did they do? They disobeyed the law. Whose side was God on? Theirs. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to fall down and worship the golden image, they were violating the law. Whose side was God on? Theirs. There's proper civil government and there's perverse civil government. There's proper family government and there's perverse family government. We are to obey proper government because that's what God designed. We are to, as Christians, to resist all evil, including evil civil government. Well, the day that the Declaration was actually signed, actually in August after they had crafted it, got it finalized copy, and all the signers came back together to sign it, Sam Adams made a speech saying, "Today we have restored the sovereign. We've put God back on the throne, to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven from the rising to the setting of the sun. Let his kingdom come." Now read the Declaration of Independence, what these men were saying. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one country to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. And they state their mission to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which natural law entitles them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which are forcing them to do what they're doing. Then they give their statement of faith. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, God has given us these rights. No man or government can take them away. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Folks, you may forfeit your life if you commit premeditated murder. You may go to the electric chair, but no one can just take your life from you legally or lawfully. No person or government can just snuff out your life without due process. You may forfeit your liberty if you commit some crime and you find yourself in prison, but no man can enslave you without due process, and no man can take you away your unalienable rights we don't have time to get into, or excuse me, your pursuit of happiness. What that means, according to Blackstone, is every man to have his own vine, every man to have his own fig tree, to have his own job, to worship the Lord, and to raise his family and enjoy all the blessings that God has in store for him. That's what the pursuit of happiness is defined at. That among these, okay, and that to secure these rights, here's the purpose of government: to secure or guarantee our unalienable God-given rights. Not to build roads and highways, not to create public schools. The purpose of civil government is to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men, and those governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter it, to abolish it, and to institute new government, which is what they were in fact doing. Having its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them that seem to affect their safety and happiness, that is stating clearly their unalienable right to always resist tyranny. And of the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance to the protection of the divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our fortunes, our lives, and our sacred honor. And then they signed their names, knowing that they would likely be hung. Now, that day, 13 British colonies became 13 sovereign nations. Just like France, just like Great Britain, there was Virginia, and there was Massachusetts. And each state, on the 4th of July, 1776, enacted in their state legislatures their own state constitutions. Let me give you an excerpt from one of them. Article 22 from the Constitution of Delaware. Every person who shall serve in office must first make this declaration: I, Paul Blair, do profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Don't tell me we were founded by atheists and deists. Why was that important? Because it was important that you knew that when no one was watching you, God was watching you. It was imperative that you can join most churches today. Simpler than you could have served in a legislature in one of the 13 original United States. Well, of course, after the Declaration, the king didn't go along with it. We had to fight a war to secure our liberty. And during that period of time, those 13 sovereign nations agreed to work together as a union of sovereign nations under a constitution called the Articles of Confederation. This is the first time you see the term the United States of America used, but it's clearly defined as 13 sovereign countries working together in an agreed union. Their purpose was to secure their common defense as they were under attack from Great Britain, and to secure their liberties and their mutual and general welfare. But it was very much stated that each state retained its own sovereignty, freedom, and independence. At the time that we won, when the Treaty of Paris was signed with Great Britain, it was a treaty not between Great Britain and the United States, but between Great Britain and 13 free, sovereign, and independent states, referred to as them. Them was the United States, 13 states that worked together. Now, there were some problems with the Articles of Confederation. You couldn't do anything without a unanimous decision. You had 13 member Congress, and all 13 had to agree in order to pass something. Obviously, that became difficult. There was no taxation. Each state was voluntarily to repay their portion of the debt. There were some problems. Some states got to the point and said, we're just not going to pay it back. There were some issues. So they decided that they needed to strengthen the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton was a believer in a national bank and a strong central government. I promise you, he would be spinning in his grave to see what we've come to. But he originally tried to call a constitutional convention in Annapolis in 1786 that was unsuccessful. All the states were very suspect, and they didn't show up. They knew that they had just fought to liberate themselves from a strong, tyrannical government, and they were deathly afraid of recreating one. But he got George Washington on his side, and they made another call in 1787. First of all, I acknowledge there were some real controversies. Alexander Hamilton failed in his first calling of a meeting in Annapolis. They called another one in Philadelphia in 1787 with the specific instructions to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to replace it. But the reality is, even with Christian men, politics is a dirty business. We better keep our eye on whoever we send to any position, whether it be city council or the United States Congress. In fact, this was so unpopular that Rhode Island didn't even show. So legally, under the Articles of Confederation, you couldn't make a decision without having all 13 states agreeing. So actually, the meeting was questionable to begin with. The great hero, Patrick Henry, the man Dan referenced last night, that made the famous statement to the Virginia legislature, "Give me liberty or give me death," was elected to serve as a representative of Virginia, but he refused to go, famously stating, "I smell a rat." However, we know historically that that meeting did happen. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. We're already operating together as 13. We already have a union, but we've got some problems. We're going to try to improve upon it. In order to form a more perfect union, they created the current Constitution, which is the civil government that we have that is supposed to bind Washington, D.C. Responsibility was delegated, and the design of the civil government was given. Article 1 deals with the legislature. You've heard it said that we have 3 co-equal branches. We do not. The legislature is the only branch that can create law, and then only in the few and defined areas where they have been delegated the authority to act. In fact, in the House of Representatives is where all spending must originate. Understand the reasoning. The government doesn't have any money. The only money the government has access to is the people's money. Well, it was the House of Representatives that represents the people, as it's there in a per capita representation. So since it's your money and my money, all spending bills must originate with the people and the House of Representatives. Then to balance that, you had the United States Senate. Every state, didn't matter what your population was. Didn't matter whether you're Oklahoma with 4 million or Florida with 30 million. Every state was equal and had equal representation of 2 senators that weren't elected by popular vote. They were appointed by the state legislature to make sure that they represented the well-being of the state. That was Article 1. Article 2, you had the executive branch. I put up there this comment, that the era referred to as the founding era presidents, our first 36 years of having a president operating under the U.S. Constitution, from George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, a total of 36 years. Those 5 presidents issued a total of 15 executive orders and 10 vetoes, total over 36 years. They didn't believe that they were elected as emperor and that they were to rule the people. They believed that they were the chief executive officer to carry out the will of the people as crafted by the People's Congress. Now, 15 executive orders is just a good day for the current Marxist-in-chief. Section 3 was the judiciary. You want to see what the responsibility of the weakest branch of our government is? The Supreme Court with a small s. All cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, all cases on the sea, controversies to which the United States are a party to, or controversies between states, or between a state and citizens of another state, or between citizens of different states, or between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states, and between the states or the citizens thereof, or foreign states, citizens or subjects. So it's a very narrow scope, none of which covers taking the Bible and prayer out of public education, none of which covers abortion, none of which covers the redefinition of marriage. But remember what Woodrow Wilson said, what one people resist but eventually accept, their children will accept it because their parents did, and everybody else will just assume it's always been that way. If you're to look on the United States Supreme Court website now, you'll find out that they have this power of judicial review, and that it's up to them to maintain a living Constitution. How many of you have a living Bible that changes all the time? In fact, now rather than remember, now that we've officially changed our position in America, marriage is no longer one man and one woman, is it? No, of course, the Bible doesn't change. God's word is established forever. We're to conform our truth to what the truth actually is. We're not supposed to change the truth to fit our feelings. We don't have a living Constitution. We have a fixed Constitution. And we're supposed to make sure that we follow it in detail. Well, it was this that was crafted, and then even when it was finished, the states wouldn't sign it without a set of handcuffs being put on all this limited civil government. 10 no-brainer reminders that in case you fall asleep and forget, according to the Bill of Rights, Congress cannot establish an official state church. Congress cannot take away your right to keep and bear arms. Congress can't do that. Congress can't do this. Congress can't do that. That's what the Bill of Rights is. Making sure that nobody forgets just how limited this government in Washington, D.C. is supposed to be. Now understand, as we have lost control of our educational system, which began in the 1960s. First, we took the Bible and prayer out in 62 and 63. Then we had the Education Act by Lyndon Johnson. And from that point on, whenever the government gives money, they also assume control. And all the schools have just ceded control to actually the United Nations now. If you want to know where our curricula comes from, it's not even from Washington. It's from the UN that our children are indoctrinated with. And we have now been trained that we have an all-power central government, and that the government created these 50 entities, these 50 divisions called the states, and we're supposed to bow down and worship the central government. Here's what we really are. We are 50 sovereign states that came together and established a limited general government for our common defense and for our general welfare. Let me give you an idea of what general welfare is. We flew down from Oklahoma on, Saturday? Yeah, Saturday. We flew down from Oklahoma. What day is today? Monday? Flew down from Oklahoma the day before yesterday. When we got to the airport, we didn't have to exchange our Oklahoma currency for Florida currency. We just use Treasury, whatever those are anymore. They used to be backed by gold and silver. Now it's just the guarantee of the federal government. But we have dollars that we can use in all 50 states. That is part of the general well-being or general welfare. We have an Army, we have a Navy, we have a Marine Corps. That is part of our common defense. So, brief reminder here. The Declaration of Independence was our birth certificate, our statement of faith, and our mission statement. We are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, and that government's sole purpose is to guarantee our rights. The Constitution was very practical. The Constitution was our owner's manual. The states designed a limited general government and then delegated few powers that were specifically given to the states. Now, in 1787, there was a fierce debate, and there was concern, even in Philadelphia, about this central government becoming too big to where it became tyrannical. James Madison wrote in what is now known as Federalist Paper number 45, dealt with this very subject. And he said this, and I quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." How many of you think that they still think their power is few and defined? Those which are to remain in state governments are numerous and indefinite. The federal government will be exercised principally on external objects such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, of which, lastly, the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the individual states will extend to all objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives of liberties and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. And the operation of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state government in times of peace and security. Folks, let me just tell you this. The only way 335 million people are going to function well together is we are going to have to either be absolutely ruled by a dictator or states have to be states. So if Massachusetts, go ahead, applaud that. You need to know this as we go. If Massachusetts wants to establish a socialist utopia and have a 50% income tax and provide everything through government administration, well, Massachusetts can give that a try. If they can be as liberal as they want to be, because that's the state of Massachusetts. But they can't impose their will or their values on Florida or on Oklahoma. Conservative states can be conservative, liberal states can be liberal, but we work together for our common defense and for our general welfare. Now, again, those are the state governments most evident in times of peace and security. As a matter of fact, James Madison wrote, dealing with the very first case of an overreach of the federal government when John Adams was in office. Madison said this, the father of the Constitution said this, in the case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted to the federal government by the compact, by the Constitution. So if the federal government does something they don't have the authority to do, the states, who are the parties that came together and wrote the Constitution and created the federal government, have the right and in fact are bound to interpose and stop the progress of this evil and to maintain within their respective state borders the authorities, rights, and liberties that pertain to them. That is how we're supposed to operate. Now remember, Woodrow Wilson, what one generation resists but eventually succumbs to, the next generation will do it because their parents did it that way. And from then on out, they'll assume it's always been that way. Now, as I said a little while ago, in 1962 and 1963, we took a biblical worldview out of our educational system. We replaced it with atheistic socialism. And over time, we are now bearing the full fruit of what we began planting in 1962. But based upon what I just showed you from the U.S. Constitution and the authority delegated to the Supreme Court, by what authority did they have to do that? None. It was, in fact, an illegal act. And the states, when they issued that verdict, that ruling, should have said, we thank you for your opinion. We're not enforcing that. That's unconstitutional. I think Governor DeSantis just might have the brassies to do that. In 1973, the Burger Court unlawfully declared that babies weren't humans and deserved civil liberties and human rights. Since that time, we have lawfully, no, it's not lawful, we've legally murdered 62 million dead babies. Now, based upon what I've just shown you, by what authority does the Supreme Court have to do that? None. 1973, the church should have been in the streets peacefully saying, we will not let that happen. 2015, the current Supreme Court redefined marriage. Based upon what I've just shown you in the Constitution, by what authority do they have to do that? Why didn't we say no? We were trying. Let me tell you, we've been ringing this bell for about 10 years. Not very many people are listening. But now you're getting people like Alan West and Ron DeSantis and some others that are starting to listen and understand how the law actually is written. And if we can reestablish the proper rule of law in America. Now let me show you just how dangerous this is as we are looking to the Supreme Court to render judgment over a living Constitution. In 2013, Justice Kennedy, who will have an apartment next to Hitler's and next to, who was it I said a while ago? Yeah, exactly. Said this as the Supreme Court declared the Defense of Marriage Act constitutional. This hypocrite actually said that the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional because the common understanding at the time of the writing of the Constitution that domestic relations of husband and wife and parent and child were matters reserved to the states. According to the Constitution, he's right. Actually, biblically, even the states have no say in this. But according to the Constitution, that would be correct. As much as I didn't like the decision, that is actually correct. Then, 2 years to the date, that liar flipped 180 degrees. And he threw out all of our defense of marriage amendments in our state constitutions, because Oklahoma had ruled and put it in the Constitution that marriage is only one man and one woman. Florida did too. He threw out the state constitutions using the Supremacy Clause and the 14th Amendment. So in 2 years, he took two sides of the same issue and wound up forcing his godless worldview on 335 million people. Now let me show you just how dangerous this precedent is. Several of you in this room are members of an organization called the Council for National Policy, of which I am a member. It is a great group of God-fearing people, for the most part, working for conservative Christian principles. Actually, it was started by a bunch of preachers. This was a clip from a question and answer period a couple of years ago. You'll notice some very recognizable people in here. Todd Starnes, he's one of us, a very good man, a writer of conservative opinions. Tony Perkins, the head of Family Research Council, is in here. Alan Sears, the former head of the ADF, is in here. Notice my question, then listen to their answer.
Paul Blair.
As far as what can we do, 2004, the state of Oklahoma amended legally our state constitution to define marriage as one man and one woman. We did everything right constitutionally, and we had one federal appointed judge throw it out. Now, when we're dealing with a judiciary that has turned the Constitution upside down, for example, the First Amendment, which is supposed to defend our religious liberty, is what they use to take away our religious liberty. When after 138 years of no such thing as incorporation doctrine, all of a sudden in 1925 they create it and start applying it to states and municipalities where we can't put up a Christmas tree at Christmas. And when they're using the 14th Amendment, which at the time that it was ratified, homosexuality was illegal in every state, but they're using the 14th Amendment to force homosexual marriage on every state. How do we win, not when we're facing judicial activism, but when we're facing judicial insanity, where it's very clearly black, yet they're saying it's white? How do we win there?
Todd Starnes.
I'd like to get a quote from the ADF, Alan Sears.
Actually, the simple answer, actually it's your business, Paul, as pastor. First thing we need to do is pray.
It's not funny. They're good people. They're on our side. They don't even understand the battle that we're in. There is no way we're going to win this game of an ever-increasing, over-powerful central government when we're looking to the central government to determine if the central government is exceeding the power of the central government. And we weren't designed to operate this way. But remember what I said about Woodrow Wilson a while ago? What one generation resists but accepts, next generation, because their parents did it, from that point on, they just assume, well, that's the way we're supposed to do it. Look at what James Madison said in 1800 in a report to his state legislature, because at the time the state legislatures were dominant. The Constitution of the United States was formed by a sanction of the states, given by each in its sovereign capacity. It adds to the stability and dignity as well as to the authority of the Constitution, and it rests on this legitimate and solid foundation. The states then being the parties to the constitutional compact, and in their sovereign capacity, it follows of necessity that there can be no Supreme Court above their authority to decide as a last resort whether the Constitution that was made by them has been violated. And consequently, that as the states are parties to it, they must themselves decide as the last resort such questions as may be of sufficient magnitude to require their interposition. In other words, if it's really, really, really a bad overreach of the federal government, then if the states have to say no. Dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by the other departments, but it's not just the legislative branch, not just the executive branch, but the judicial department may also exercise or sanction dangerous powers beyond the grant of the Constitution, and consequently that the ultimate right of the parties to the Constitution to judge whether the compact has been dangerously violated, they must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as by the executive or by the legislature. Ultimately, it's up to the state of Florida to say no when Washington tries to implement a vaccine passport. Ultimately, it's up to the state of Washington, or state of Florida, to say no and stop the murder of preborn children. Ultimately, it's up to the state of Florida to say no when they want to violate our Second Amendment and force gun buybacks. And understand, when they talk about terrorists, they aren't talking about guys yelling Allahu Akbar and flying into airplanes. They're talking about the people in this room as terrorists. Thomas Jefferson, the man that penned the Declaration of Independence, said this: "The individual states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to the federal government, but they have a compact that we call the Constitution of the United States, and we can modify it by amendments for a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain defined powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whenever the federal government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force." Thomas Jefferson, ladies and gentlemen. So I am about to wrap up here in just a moment, 2 slides, and then we're going to watch a video, a short video that you're going to enjoy. Then I'll break us for our next break. We'll have one more class before lunch. Let me ask you real quickly, are you enjoying what you're hearing? Education and information is power. That's why they want to control education and control the media. Understand, hard tyranny is what they have in North Korea, what they had in Cuba, the Soviet Union, Red China, enslaves the body. Remember what I said in the first presentation. Before you can enslave the body, you must first enslave the mind. They do that by taking control of education, by controlling the media, and then by having no freedom of conscience. Consequently, there can be no freedom of religion. Right now, we are ensnared and enslaved by soft tyranny. Let me just say this. I didn't even like Donald Trump when he ran for office. I was a Ted Cruz supporter. I was never a Trump fan. I didn't like him, but I never even watched his show. You're fired. I don't care. But after he was the last one standing, I took a chance because I knew that Hillary was a Marxist. Although Trump's rough around the edges, I've been a guy that's been attacked. Trust me, I've run for office, and when you take strong stands on moral issues like this, you will be called everything. You will be lied about. And if you're a public figure, they can get away with it. That's amazing. If you lie about somebody else, that's against the law. But if you're considered a public figure, they can say whatever you want to about you. So it can get ugly, and recognize that's the way. I don't know how the man lasted 4 years without committing suicide. I really don't. He is a tough scrapper. But most of his policies have been great for America. He is truly an American president. And can you believe every president that ran for office in my lifetime, going all the way back to Nixon, was about one of the first ones I remember as a youngster. Everybody said, oh, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. We ought to move our embassy back to Jerusalem. Every time they got elected, no one did it. They said, oh, it can't be done. Trump got in office and said, we're moving our embassy. Oh, there's going to be war, there's going to be riot. Look what happened. I love having a guy that was actually concerned about us and didn't give a rip about politics. But understand, Donald Trump made CRT, critical race theory, illegal. Donald Trump had pledged in his second term that he was going to abolish abortion. I was really excited about what we were on the precipice of. But if you don't believe in globalism, if you don't believe in the deep state, you now see Donald Trump took on the deep state, and look who's still standing in Washington. We are not going to take back Washington. The states must assume control over Washington. We now are in soft tyranny. They suppress the truth, misinformation, rewritten history. Have you noticed how everything they said about COVID-19 was wrong? And now they're admitting it. But now it doesn't matter because nobody's paying attention. You're being silenced or shut down. You're being deplatformed. You're being fired. You're being intimidated into silence. This is soft tyranny. If we don't stop this, that's where it's going to wind up. Final slide, and then we're going to do this video. You're going to love the video, and then you're going to love Fisher. Fisher's going to get up, and I know I've almost put you to sleep. He's going to dazzle you. See that red thing right there? It's called Oklahoma. You know what that line is? Yeah, it's called a border. You know why we have a border? Because Oklahoma is a sovereign state. One of my church members calling me. They never leave you alone. And you all have just witnessed, I just broomed one of my church members. I'll call him back. Trust me, I know this guy. This isn't an emergency. You all have them too. We have one of these in the state of Oklahoma. You know what it is? It's a capital. You know why we have a capital? Because Oklahoma's a state. We have one of these in Oklahoma. Kevin Stitt. You know what he is? He's the governor of the state of Oklahoma. You know, in Oklahoma, we've got one of these. It's an elected legislature. We've got a House and a Senate. Dan served 2 terms in the House. You know that Dan was unopposed in his 3rd term and quit because he wasn't able to accomplish anything because of the Republicans that were stopping all the good bills? He was so frustrated, he figured he could do more good outside the legislature than inside the legislature. Even Fisher can win a race unopposed. And if he had served all 12 years, he would have retired with a nice, tidy state pension. But he is a man of such integrity and character. It wasn't about state pension, it was about principle. But we have a legislature. You know why? Because we're a state. We also have one of these. It's called a state constitution. You know why? Because we're a state. We also have one of these, a Supreme Court. You know why? Because we're a state of Oklahoma. I got news for you. You all have one too here in the state of Florida. And by the way, it's we the people of the United States of America. God bless you. You are going to enjoy this video.